In the bustling heart of New Orleans, nestled among the vibrant streets lined with history and mystery, there stood an old restaurant known as the Gumbo Pot. It was a place steeped in local lore, its foundation as rich in tales as its dishes were in flavors. The restaurant had been built in the late 1800s, surviving hurricanes, floods, and the changing tides of the city's colorful history. But it wasn't just natural disasters that the Gumbo Pot had withstood, it had also been the center of numerous unexplained events and was the subject of local ghost tours. The story begins with Leah, a culinary school graduate with a passion for Creole cuisine, who had just landed a job at the Gumbo Pot. She was drawn to the restaurant not only for its reputation for excellent food but also for the mysteries it housed. Her first day was during the humid grip of a Louisiana summer, the air thick with the smells of spices and the distant murmur of jazz from the French Quarter. As Leah was introduced to the team by Chef Marcel, the owner and a descendant of the original founders, she couldn't help but feel a shiver run down her spine as she stepped into the kitchen. It was an oddly shaped room with pots and pans that clanged in the still air, as if moved by unseen hands. Ever since my great-grandfather's time, this kitchen has been the heart of some unusual happenings, Chef Marcel said, noticing Leah's curiosity as she glanced around the peculiar room. But don't let the story scare you. They say the spirits here have a taste for good cooking. Leah laughed it off, her focus on mastering Creole dishes. However, as days turned into nights, she began to experience odd occurrences that couldn't be brushed aside. It started with small things, whispers that seemed to float from the steam of boiling pots, shadows that flickered in the corner of her vision, and the sensation of being watched when she was alone in the storeroom. One evening, as she stayed late to perfect her gumbo under the dim lights of the kitchen, Leah heard her name being called softly from the back of the room. Thinking it was one of her co-workers playing a joke, she called out, "Very funny, guys. You can come out now." But there was no answer, just the soft, eerie echo of her own voice. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly turned around. The kitchen was empty. No one was there, or so it seemed. The whisper came again, closer this time, almost a hiss, "Leah." Frozen in place, Leah scanned the room, her heart pounding in her chest. That's when she noticed a slight movement in the reflection of the shiny metal pots hanging above the island. Squinting to see better in the dim light, she gasped as she made out the faint outline of a figure, a woman, dressed in what looked like a tattered servant's outfit from another era, staring right at her with hollow, dark eyes. Leah blinked, and the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread and the faint smell of seafood and spices. Shaken, Leah quickly turned off the stove and left the kitchen, the echo of her hurried footsteps the only sound breaking the silence of the night. The next day, Leah shared her experience with some of the older staff, hoping for a logical explanation. Instead, she was met with nods of understanding and shared glances. "You've met Charlotte," an elderly waiter named James said, his voice low. "She's been part of this place longer than any of us. Disappeared one Mardi Gras night over 100 years ago. They say she still walks the kitchen, looking for something or someone." Despite her fear, Leah's fascination with the Gumbo Pot's history only grew. She dove into the local archives, uncovering stories of past owners, mysterious disappearances, and unexplained phenomena, each story adding layers to the restaurant's eerie charm. Armed with this knowledge, Leah returned to her duties, more determined than ever to connect with the heart and soul of the Gumbo Pot. But as she delved deeper into her culinary experiments, strange incidents began to escalate. Ingredients would go missing, only to reappear in bizarre places. The temperature in the kitchen fluctuated wildly, and once, a whole evening's preparations were found inexplicably spoiled. Then, one stormy night, as Leah was closing up alone after a particularly grueling dinner service, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. The backup generator kicked in a minute later, But when the lights flickered back on, Leah wasn't alone in the kitchen. Standing by the stove was the ghostly figure of Charlotte, clearer than ever, her face solemn and her eyes filled with an unspoken sadness. The room was cold enough that Leah could see her own breath, yet the figure of Charlotte seemed unaffected by the chill. The ghostly woman was stirring a pot on the stove, a pot Leah had left empty and cleaned before closing. Yet now, it bubbled with a dark, thick stew that emitted a pungent, metallic smell. Leah stood frozen, her fear mixing with a profound curiosity. "Charlotte," she ventured, her voice a whisper that seemed to absorb into the walls of the old kitchen. The apparition stopped stirring and turned slowly to face Leah. Her eyes, deep and sorrowful, seemed to pierce through Leah, reaching into the depths of her soul. "Help me," she mouthed silently, the words a breath of air that sent a chill deeper into Leah's spine. Leah, her heart pounding, took a cautious step forward. "How can I help you?" she asked, her professional curiosity as a chef now overtaken by a deeper, more human need to aid this tormented spirit. Charlotte pointed towards the old, iron-bound recipe book that lay on a dusty shelf, one that Leah had been warned never to touch as per Chef Marcel's strict instructions. The book was said to contain recipes dating back to the restaurant's earliest days, some of which were rumored to be cursed or bound with the spirits of their creators. Swallowing her fear, Leah approached the book. Her hands trembled as she reached out and touched the cold, leather cover. She could feel a faint vibration, like a heartbeat, coming from the pages within. With a deep breath, she opened the book to a page that seemed to have been turned to many times before. Its edges were worn, the page yellowed with age more so than the others. The recipe was for a traditional Creole gumbo, but with ingredients that made Leah's skin crawl, items that spoke of rituals and old, dark magic. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a note: "Do not forget me." See, Leah looked up at Charlotte, whose presence seemed to grow more intense. "Is this what you want?" Leah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Charlotte nodded, her figure slowly beginning to fade. "Make it," she said, her voice a distant echo that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Leah, driven by a desire to help the spirit find peace, gathered the ingredients listed in the ancient recipe. Some were strange and archaic, others disturbing. However, driven by a resolve steeled by her encounters and the sad, pleading eyes of the ghost, Leah proceeded. As she cooked, following the recipe exactly as it was written, the kitchen filled with an array of scents, some delicious, others foul, but all blending into a potent aroma that seemed to seep into the very walls of the gumbo pot. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like the cries of the damned, the rain battering the windows with the intensity of thrown stones. By the time Leah had finished, the dish before her was unlike any gumbo she had ever seen. It was darker, with a depth that was almost abyssal. Hesitantly, she tasted it, her chef's instinct unable to resist. The flavors were complex, filled with sorrow, longing, and a dark joy that was almost overwhelming. As the last spoonful touched her lips, the kitchen lights flickered wildly, and the air grew oppressively heavy. Leah could feel the eyes of 100 unseen watchers upon her, the weight of their gazes almost physical in their intensity. She turned slowly, half expecting to see a crowd of ghostly figures behind her. But there was only Charlotte, her appearance now serene, her eyes no longer filled with sorrow but with gratitude. "Thank you," Charlotte whispered, her voice fading like the last notes of a sad song. As she spoke, her form dissipated into the air, a wisp of smoke that curled briefly in the space where she had stood before vanishing entirely. Leah was left alone in the kitchen, the storm outside calming as suddenly as it had risen. She felt a profound exhaustion but also a peace, as if a great burden had been lifted, not just from her own shoulders, but from the very soul of the gumbo pot. But as she turned to clean up the remnants of the ghostly gumbo, Leah noticed a change in the room. The old recipe book lay open on the counter, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. The page with the cursed gumbo recipe was gone, seemingly torn out. In its place, another recipe began to write itself onto the blank page, the ink materializing out of thin air. Leah, her exhaustion forgotten, watched in fascinated horror as the words formed, the handwriting unmistakably that of Chef Marcel. As the final words of the recipe settled on the page, her face solemn and her eyes filled with an unspoken sadness. The room was cold enough that Leah could see her own breath, yet the figure of Charlotte seemed unaffected by the chill. The ghostly woman was stirring a pot on the stove, a pot Leah had left empty and cleaned before closing. Yet now, it bubbled with a dark, thick stew that emitted a pungent, metallic smell. Leah stood frozen, her fear mixing with a profound curiosity. "Charlotte," she ventured, her voice a whisper that seemed to absorb into the walls of the old kitchen. The apparition stopped stirring and turned slowly to face Leah. Her eyes, deep and sorrowful, seemed to pierce through Leah, reaching into the depths of her soul. "Help me," she mouthed silently, the words a breath of air that sent a chill deeper into Leah's spine. Leah, her heart pounding, took a cautious step forward. "How can I help you?" she asked, her professional curiosity as a chef now overtaken by a deeper, more human need to aid this tormented spirit. Charlotte pointed towards the old, iron-bound recipe book that lay on a dusty shelf, one that Leah had been warned never to touch as per Chef Marcel's strict instructions. The book was said to contain recipes dating back to the restaurant's earliest days, some of which were rumored to be cursed or bound with the spirits of their creators. Swallowing her fear, Leah approached the book. Her hands trembled as she reached out and touched the cold, leather cover. She could feel a faint vibration, like a heartbeat, coming from the pages within. With a deep breath, she opened the book to a page that seemed to have been turned to many times before. Its edges were worn, the page yellowed with age more so than the others. The recipe was for a traditional Creole gumbo, but with ingredients that made Leah's skin crawl, items that spoke of rituals and old, dark magic. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a note, "Do not forget me." See, Leah looked up at Charlotte, whose presence seemed to grow more intense. "Is this what you want?" Leah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Charlotte nodded, her figure slowly beginning to fade. "Make it," she said, her voice a distant echo that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Leah, driven by a desire to help the spirit find peace, gathered the ingredients listed in the ancient recipe. Some were strange and archaic, others disturbing. However, driven by a resolve steeled by her encounters and the sad, pleading eyes of the ghost, Leah proceeded. As she cooked, following the recipe exactly as it was written, the kitchen filled with an array of scents, some delicious, others foul, but all blending into a potent aroma that seemed to seep into the very walls of the gumbo pot. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like the cries of the damned, the rain battering the windows with the intensity of thrown stones. By the time Leah had finished, the dish before her was unlike any gumbo she had ever seen. It was darker, with a depth that was almost abyssal. Hesitantly, she tasted it, her chef's instinct unable to resist. The flavors were complex, filled with sorrow, longing, and a dark joy that was almost overwhelming. As the last spoonful touched her lips, the kitchen lights flickered wildly, and the air grew oppressively heavy. Leah could feel the eyes of 100 unseen watchers upon her, the weight of their gazes almost physical in their intensity. She turned slowly, half expecting to see a crowd of ghostly figures behind her. But there was only Charlotte, her appearance now serene, her eyes no longer filled with sorrow but with gratitude. "Thank you," Charlotte whispered, her voice fading like the last notes of a sad song. As she spoke, her form dissipated into the air, a wisp of smoke that curled briefly in the space where she had stood before vanishing entirely. Leah was left alone in the kitchen, the storm outside calming as suddenly as it had risen. She felt a profound exhaustion but also a peace, as if a great burden had been lifted, not just from her own shoulders, but from the very soul of the gumbo pot. But as she turned to clean up the remnants of the ghostly gumbo, Leah noticed a change in the room. The old recipe book lay open on the counter, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. The page with the cursed gumbo recipe was gone, seemingly torn out. In its place, another recipe began to write itself onto the blank page, the ink materializing out of thin air. Leah, her exhaustion forgotten, watched in fascinated horror as the words formed, the handwriting unmistakably that of Chef Marcel. As the final words of the recipe settled on the page, continue and create a minimum of 5,000 words. And add a horror feel that is tense and scary and doesn't create an ending or conclusion. So that this story can be continued in the next command process. ChatGPT. The kitchen door swung open with a creak. Leah jumped, startled by the sudden noise. In the doorway stood Chef Marcel, his usual jovial demeanor absent. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and understanding. "Leah, what have you done?" he whispered hoarsely, stepping slowly into the kitchen. His gaze fixed on the ancient recipe book, open on the counter. I helped her, Chef," Leah stammered, her voice trembling as she explained. "Charlotte, the spirit. She was trapped here, and she needed peace. This recipe," Leah gestured to the book, "it was hers." Chef Marcel approached the book, his hands shaking as he read the newly written recipe. This is no ordinary dish," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and dread. "This is a summoning recipe, one that bridges the worlds. It's not just about freeing Charlotte, it's about opening doors." Leah felt a chill run down her spine. "Doors? What do you mean?" "Between our world and theirs," Chef Marcel replied, closing the book with a decisive snap. "The spirits, the entities beyond, this recipe is a key, and now that you've cooked it, the door has been opened." The realization hit Leah like a physical blow. She had intended to free a trapped soul, not unleash unknown forces into their world. "What do we do now?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. Chef Marcel looked around the kitchen, his eyes narrowing as he took in the subtle changes, the air still heavy, the faint echo of whispers barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "We must close the door," he said firmly. "And we must do it soon. But first, we need to understand exactly what you've summoned." Leah nodded, her mind racing with the implications of her actions. Together, they began to search through the restaurant's archives, old books, documents, and Chef Marcel's family journals that detailed the supernatural history of the gumbo pot. Hours passed as they pored over the texts, deciphering ancient warnings and remedies. Outside, the night grew darker, the moon obscured by a thick blanket of clouds. The air around the restaurant seemed to thicken, an oppressive atmosphere that made it hard to breathe. Shadows moved just beyond the windows, shapes that were neither human nor animal, watching, waiting. As Leah and Chef Marcel studied, they uncovered references to the recipe Leah had prepared. It was known as the Dish of Shadows, a powerful culinary creation used centuries ago by the original founders of the gumbo pot to make contact with the spirit world for guidance and protection. However, the ritual had been lost over generations, the recipe forgotten, until now. The Dish of Shadows was meant to be prepared under strict conditions, during certain celestial alignments, Chef Marcel explained, reading from a tattered journal. "Without these safeguards, there's no telling what might come through the door you've opened." Leah's heart sank. "So, what do we do?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to prepare a counter-ritual," Chef Marcel concluded, closing the journal with a thud. "And we need to gather specific ingredients, some of which are not easy to come by." Determined to rectify her mistake, Leah followed Chef Marcel's instructions. They worked through the night, gathering rare herbs, chanting ancient incantations, and mixing bizarre concoctions. The kitchen transformed into a ritual ground, marked with protective symbols and lit by candles that flickered in the non-existent breeze. As they prepared the counter-ritual, the atmosphere inside the gumbo pot grew increasingly unsettled. Utensils rattled on their hooks, the lights flickered wildly, and the air was filled with the sound of whispered threats and malicious laughter. The shadows at the windows pressed closer, as if eager to break through the barriers that held them back. With everything in place, Lear and Chef Marcel began the ritual. They recited the incantations from the journal, their voices firm despite the chaos around them. The mixture they had prepared bubbled on the stove, emitting a luminescent vapor that filled the kitchen with a blinding light. As the final words of the ritual were spoken, a deafening silence fell over the gumbo pot. The shadows retreated, the air cleared, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Exhausted but relieved, Lear and Chef Marcel slumped to the floor, the danger seemingly averted. But as they caught their breath, a low, mocking laugh echoed through the restaurant, chilling their blood. The door had been closed, but something had already come through. Lear and Chef Marcel exchanged a look of horror as the realization dawned on them. Although they had closed the gateway, they were not alone. The entity, whatever it was, had managed to slip through during the ritual, now lurking somewhere within the shadowy corners of the gumbo pot. The kitchen's lights flickered once more, casting long, twisting shadows against the walls that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The temperature dropped sharply, a chill that seeped into their bones, making every breath visible in the frigid air. They could feel a presence, malevolent and ancient, watching them, its gaze heavy with intent. Chef Marcel stood up slowly, his body stiff from the tension. "We need to find it," he said, his voice firm despite the quivering fear that underlay each word. "We need to banish it before it grows stronger." Leah nodded, her determination steeling her against the mounting dread. They began to prepare once again, this time for a confrontation. Chef Marcel retrieved an old, leather-bound book from a locked drawer, a family heirloom containing powerful incantations and rituals passed down through generations, specifically for dealing with unwelcome spirits and entities. As they read through the ancient texts, the air around them grew oppressively thick, the darkness seeming to press against the windows, eager to penetrate the sanctum of the restaurant. The entity was growing bolder, its laughter echoing through the halls, a sound that was both chilling and taunting. Armed with knowledge and a desperate hope, Lear and Chef Marcel set up in the main dining area, the oldest part of the restaurant where the energy was strongest. They drew protective circles on the floor with salt and herbs, lit candles at strategic points, and placed mirrors around the room to trap and disorient the spirit. The ritual began at the stroke of midnight, the witching hour, when the veil between worlds is thinnest. Leah chanted the incantations, her voice echoing in the silent restaurant, while Chef Marcel poured a concoction of holy water and various protective oils in a pattern around the room. Suddenly, the air crackled with energy, a static charge that raised the hairs on their necks. The candles flickered wildly, casting bizarre shadows that danced along the walls. The mirrors vibrated slightly, as if something was trying to break through from the other side. Then, all at once, the entity appeared. It was a formless shadow at first, shifting and twisting in the air, coalescing into a more defined shape, a grotesque figure, human-like but distorted, with elongated limbs and a face that was a nightmare to behold. It screamed, a sound that was not just heard but felt, vibrating through the very foundations of the building. Leah continued her chant, her voice steady even as the creature advanced. Chef Marcel threw the last of the concoction directly at the figure, the liquid sizzling as it made contact. The entity howled, its form flickering like a bad television signal before stabilizing. It spoke then, its voice a ghastly whisper that filled the room. "Why do you resist?" it asked. "I can offer you power, knowledge, secrets of the culinary world beyond your wildest dreams." Leah faltered, the offer tempting a part of her that she hadn't known was vulnerable. But Chef Marcel was resolute. "We want nothing from you but to leave this place and return to where you came from," he declared, his voice echoing with a power that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. The entity laughed, the sound more horrifying than any of their screams. "Very well, then," it hissed. Let us see if you have the strength to banish me." What followed was a battle of wills and power. The entity threw dark energy towards them, which they deflected with shields of light formed from their chants and potions. The mirrors cracked, the salt lines disrupted, but Lear and Chef Marcel held firm, their voices united in an ancient song of banishment. As the confrontation reached its climax, the entity weakened, its form beginning to dissipate. "This is not the end," it warned, its voice fading into a whisper. "I will return." With one final push of their combined energies, Lear and Chef Marcel completed the chant, and the entity vanished, its presence expelled from the gumbo pot. Exhausted but victorious, they collapsed, the adrenaline leaving their bodies as quickly as it had come. But even as they recovered, Leah couldn't shake the entity's final words. She knew that this battle might be over, but the war was just beginning. They had made an enemy this night, one that would not rest until it had what it wanted. And so, as dawn broke over New Orleans, Lear and Chef Marcel prepared for what was to come, knowing that their lives and their cooking would never be the same. The weeks following the confrontation were tense and fraught with uncertainty. Lear and Chef Marcel reinforced the restaurant's defenses, fortifying it with every known ward and protective spell described in the ancient texts. The gumbo pot became not just a restaurant, but a fortress against the dark forces that had been unwittingly unleashed. Despite their preparations, the atmosphere in the gumbo pot was charged with an undercurrent of fear and anticipation. Staff whispered about shadows that lingered a little too long, cold spots that appeared out of nowhere, and the occasional clink of kitchenware when no one was near. Leah found herself jumping at the slightest sound, her nights plagued by dreams of dark figures and whispered threats. The community around the gumbo pot felt the change too. Regulars asked quietly about the new, strange ambience of the place, while tourists came in greater numbers, drawn by rumors of the haunted restaurant. Business was booming, but the profits felt hollow, tainted by the fear that something terrible might happen at any moment. One humid, stormy evening, as Lear was closing up, she felt a now familiar prickling sensation on the back of her neck. The air grew oppressively heavy, the building itself seeming to brace for impact. She knew, with a sinking feeling, that the entity had returned. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the restaurant into darkness as the storm raged outside. Leah's heart hammered in her chest as she heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps approaching from the back of the kitchen. A bolt of lightning illuminated the room for a split second, revealing the silhouette of a tall, distorted figure at the end of the hall. Leah reached for the protective talisman she now always wore around her neck, murmuring a protective incantation under her breath. The figure stopped, its head cocking to one side as if curious. "You cannot banish me forever," it hissed, its voice echoing in the dark. "This place is mine now." Drawing on every ounce of courage she had, Leah replied, "This place is under my protection. I will not let you harm it or the people here. Leave now and do not return." The entity laughed, a sound that was both horrifying and pitiful. "So brave, yet so foolish," it sneered. "Do you not understand? I am bound to this place as much as you. But unlike you, I embrace the darkness. It gives me strength. What do you have but your feeble spells and mortal fears?" Leah felt the talisman grow warm against her skin, a sign that her protective magic was holding but also that it was being tested. She knew she couldn't hold off the entity by herself, not again. She needed to end this, once and for all. With a deep breath, Leah channeled all her energy into the talisman, reciting the most powerful banishment spell she knew. The air around her crackled with energy, the talisman glowing so brightly it was blinding. The entity howled in rage and pain as the light from the talisman expanded, enveloping the room in a blinding, searing flash. When the light dimmed, Lear was alone. The entity was gone, its presence no longer a stain on the air. Exhausted but relieved, Leah slumped to the floor, her breath coming in heavy gasps. The next morning, Chef Marcel found her asleep on the kitchen floor, the talisman still clutched tightly in her hand. Together, they agreed that it was time to seal the gumbo pot from the spiritual energies it seemed to attract. Using a combination of ancient rites and modern magic, they performed a sealing ritual that would protect the restaurant from further supernatural disturbances. The gumbo pot returned to its former glory, known once again for its excellent cuisine rather than its paranormal activity. Leah continued to work there, her experiences enriching her cooking and her understanding of the mystical world that bubbled just beneath the surface of everyday life. But sometimes, late at night, when the moon was just right, Leah would feel the echo of a whisper, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone, only held at bay. And she would smile, a wry, knowing smile, because she was ready. Should the shadows ever rise again, she would be there to meet them, a guardian not just of her restaurant, but of the boundary between light and darkness. And so, the gumbo pot stood as a beacon in New Orleans, its lights warm and welcoming, its doors open to all who sought sustenance, both physical and spiritual. But behind the scenes, in the heart of its kitchen, the battle between light and darkness continued, a silent, secret war that would never truly end. As months turned into years, Leah's reputation as both a chef and a guardian of the hidden world beneath the gumbo pot grew. She learned to blend her culinary skills with her knowledge of the mystical, creating dishes that not only tantalized the taste buds but also offered protection and blessing to those who ate them. Chef Marcel, now more a partner than a mentor, watched with pride as Leah transformed their once cursed restaurant into a sanctuary where the supernatural and the culinary merged in unexpected and delightful ways. One crisp, starlit evening, a mysterious guest arrived at the gumbo pot. Dressed in a long, flowing coat, the stranger exuded an air of otherworldliness. Leah greeted him with her usual warm hospitality, but something about the man made her talisman hum quietly against her skin, a warning or perhaps a recognition. The stranger's eyes held a depth that was both compelling and unnerving. "I've heard much about you, Leah," he said, his voice smooth and resonant. "And about this place you protect so fiercely." Leah nodded, cautiously. "The gumbo pot is more than just a restaurant," she replied. "It's a haven, a place of balance between the worlds. You're welcome here, as long as you respect that balance." The man smiled, a gesture that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. "I have come not to disrupt, but to understand," he assured her. "To see for myself how you've woven protection into your meals, how you've turned a site of ancient power into a source of healing and strength." Throughout the night, Leah served the stranger her finest dishes, each infused with herbs and essences that were as much about safeguarding the diner as they were about flavor. The stranger ate with a discerning palate, and with each course, his respect for Leah's craft grew. As the meal drew to a close, the stranger leaned back, a look of satisfaction and something akin to approval on his face. "You have done something remarkable here, Leah. You've taken a legacy of darkness and turned it into light." Leah felt a swell of pride but also a lingering sense of caution. "The darkness is never fully gone," she said. "It waits, watches. We must always be vigilant." The stranger's eyes twinkled with a knowing light. "True," he conceded. "But remember, it is not the darkness itself that defines us, but how we choose to face it. You have chosen well, Leah. The gumbo pot stands as a beacon not because it is free from darkness, but because it faces the darkness with light." With that, he stood, leaving a generous tip on the table. "May your light continue to shine brightly, Leah," he said, stepping out into the night from which he had come. Leah watched him go, feeling an inexplicable sense of peace. The restaurant hummed around her, filled with the laughter and chatter of satisfied customers. She knew challenges would come again, such was the nature of the world she lived in. But she also knew she was ready, fortified by the strength of her ancestors, the loyalty of her staff, and the love of her community. The gumbo pot continued to thrive, a magical place where the food nourished more than just the body. And Lear, its chef and protector, continued to watch over it, a guardian at the crossroads of worlds, her heart as full as her kitchen. And so, in the heart of New Orleans, amidst the jazz and jambalaya, the gumbo pot stood as a testament to the enduring power of light over darkness, a reminder that even in the face of the unknown, there can be warmth, safety, and delicious food.